Hello and welcome to the CBC Butterfly Blitz 2022 training session on how to identify butterflies. My name is Laura Timms. I'm an ecologist at CBC and I will be your speaker for today's session. You'll note that my picture in the bottom corner of the screen is going to turn on and off depending on the slide so that I don't block your view of any of the pictures in this webinar, in this presentation. So an outline of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to introduce the ideas involved with identifying butterflies, go through some useful ID resources, some basics of butterfly anatomy. I'll walk through the process that I use when identifying butterflies and hope that'll be helpful for you. Review the watershed butterfly checklist and give some quick ID tips for common species in the 5 families of butterflies that we have here. Then we'll do a little recap, and finally I'll talk briefly about using a butterfly net, which is sometimes necessary when identifying butterflies. So let's get started. How to identify butterflies? Well, like most things, identifying butterflies is really helped by experience. The more you do it, the better you get at it, the more you will remember. And experts on butterflies that have been doing it for a long time can identify most species in their area just based on their gestalt, or their just overall sense of the butterfly, how it flies, how it moves, where you see it, the general pattern of color. But those are people that have been working on that for a long time. So if you're not there yet, don't feel bad. If you're just starting, you've got time to learn, and butterflies are not that hard to learn. So in addition to having that experience and memory, it's just as important to know what resources to use to help you get that knowledge to learn and what features to look at. And the more you do it, the better you'll get. So let's hope you get a lot of experience doing that this summer with the Butterfly Blitz. So here are some useful identification resources that will help you as you're looking for butterflies in the Credit River watershed. So first, we've got this folding pocket guide, The Butterflies of Southern and Eastern Ontario. Now, if you've worked with the Butterfly Blitz in the past, you may have received this as part of your registration package. If you don't have it yet and you would like it as part of your registration, let us know. There should have been an option in when you filled out your registration form to let us know that, and you'll receive that guide. There's a couple other bigger field copy field guides, hard copy field guides that I like to use. One is the ROM Field Guide to Butterflies of Ontario, and there's also Butterflies Through Binoculars, the East. Now, I really like the ROM one because it's focused specifically on Ontario, so you don't have to flip through pages of butterflies that don't occur here. And it's got lots of really great specific information for Ontario, for those butterflies, when you're likely to see them, what kind of habitats, etc. If you're looking for online guides, which are free, the website Bug Guide is really great. It gives you all sorts of identification tips and details about the biology of species. And then there's also Butterflies of Canada. Now, we have provided links and information about all of these resources in a page that is part of your registration package and that you can also find on our website. And I'll go through later how you can actually get to that part of our website and find that information. So I'd like to briefly go through some details of butterfly anatomy. And this is not so that you can be experts in the anatomy of insects or butterflies, but because when you're reading descriptions of species, they'll often refer to particular parts of butterflies' bodies, and you need to know where they're talking about so that you can go and check to look for what they're telling you to find, be it a spot or a line or what have you. So like all insects, butterflies have 3 body parts. They have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. They also have 2 pairs of wings, the forewings, those are the ones closest to the head, and the hind wings, that's the second pair. And you'll find that most of the useful identification features are on the wings, so that will often be what people are referring to, although occasionally they refer to antennae or the general size of the butterfly. Now on the wings, there are often cells that will be areas bordered by veins, and those are thicker, harder parts of the butterfly's wings. Let's look at the forewings and the hind wings a little more closely in the next slide. So understanding the terminology when a description is talking about wings can be really helpful when reading species descriptions. So we always work from the body outwards. So the apex is the furthest away from the body, the very tip. And same, the margin of the wing is the furthest away from the body, the outside edge. And so sometimes a description will refer to a marginal band, and that would be a band of color or pattern that's near the margin of the wing. And then submarginal, which would be just inside that. There might be a median band, and that would be a band in the middle of the wing. And then post-median would be after that, further away from the body than that. So sometimes these pictures are reading a species description, it'll point to exactly what it's talking about, but if it doesn't, it helps to know these basic features. It's really important to look at both sides of butterfly wings. So as you'll see in these pictures here, there's 3 different species in the upper side of their wing and the lower side of the wing, and you'll see that the patterns are different. So you do need to look at both the upper and lower side often to be able to identify a butterfly. Field guides will usually show you images of both the upper and lower wings for a species. And if it doesn't, it's because either you're very unlikely to see that side of the wing. Some butterflies usually sit with their wings closed, so you're never going to see the upper side, or it's not that relevant for identifying it that you really only need to see one side. But generally, you'd like to be able to see both if you can. Okay, I mentioned that I was going to walk you through my process for identifying butterflies. So the first step is that some species I do just know right away. And even if you're an extreme beginner at butterflies, there's probably at least one species that you also just know right away, and that would be the monarch butterfly. So the picture on the right there is a monarch butterfly happily floating around in a field of wildflowers. And if I get a picture of a monarch, even if it's from really, really far away, you can usually identify it because it's so distinctive. Now, I've also included on this slide a picture of a viceroy butterfly, and that's the one that sometimes trips people up because it does look a lot like a monarch butterfly. It is a mimic of a monarch butterfly. But even those you will find are actually pretty easy to tell apart from monarchs once you take a closer look, in that they're smaller, a little rounder, and they have a line going across their hind wing. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But that's my first step for identifying butterflies. Sometimes you just know the species. You never have to look it up. You're just like, yep, that's a monarch. So, it's great when you see one of those. For other species, you have to work a little bit harder. So say you see one of those species and you're not quite sure exactly what it is. So if I have a sense of the kind of butterfly it is, I might flip to that section of a field guide, be that a pocket guide or a book, and I'll just browse around. And I'll try to see something that looks close. So in this picture here, I might see it and I'd be like, oh, that's one of those ladies or something like that. Which one is it? And then I'll flip to the guide and I'll look and I'll see, oh, I think it's one of those. So yeah, that's always a good thing to do too. And it will also help you just become more familiar with the butterflies in general because you'll be reminding yourself each time you flip through what those different species are. So then I get something in the guide that I think might be what I'm looking for. And I compare my picture, if I've taken a picture of the butterfly or if I'm looking at it live in the field, I'll compare it with the pictures in the guide, looking for differences between what I'm seeing and the pictures in the guide. And you have to look at lots of small differences. So, you have to be looking at those different patterns in all parts of the wing. And I've highlighted a couple of differences in these 2 pictures here because even though they look very similar, those are actually different species of butterfly. Now, if you're familiar with them, you might not think they look that similar at all, but at a high level, they actually do look pretty similar. So I would select the possible species. I would say, I think it's an American lady. Okay, so then I would want to read that species description fully. So that's where we get. So I've decided I think it's an American lady. I want to read the description for that species in either a hard copy field guide or an online field guide to read what the distinguishing characteristics of that species are. And I try to ensure that what I'm looking at matches those distinguishing characteristics completely. So yes, how many eye spots does it have? It has 2, great. Does it have that little clear spot in the forewing? It does, great. And then oftentimes guides will say, here are some species that look similar to this species, and this is how you can tell them apart. And so that's very helpful because that will help you know that you're not actually making a mistake and thinking this butterfly is one thing when it's actually something that it looks just a lot alike. You can also use some other clues to help you identify butterflies. Things like the date you're observing the species, the habitat you're seeing it in, the host plant it's around, or even how rare it is. So some species you're only likely to see in the early spring or the late summer. So if the field guide's telling you that it's an early spring butterfly, but you're seeing it in August, you have probably got the wrong species. I've got an example here illustrating differences in habitat. So the mustard white butterfly and the cabbage white butterfly are both small white butterflies, but the mustard white you're likely to find in sort of healthy, intact forest situations. The cabbage white you're going to find literally everywhere, especially disturbed urban areas. There are some differences in how these two species look as well, but knowing where you find it, if you see a white butterfly in the middle of a forest, it's probably not a cabbage white. Take a closer look and see if it's a mustard white. This other example at the bottom, the eyed brown and the Appalachian brown, are both wetland-loving butterflies, but one of them is found usually just inside the forested area beside a wetland, and the other one is usually found in an open area of a wetland. And these pictures are actually from a day where we found both of these species in exactly the type of habitat they were supposed to be found, but it was only separated by about 50 meters. It was really nice. They were following the rules of the field guide. If you are reading a species description and you're pretty sure it matches what you've got, but it says this butterfly is super rare, just do a few more double checks to make sure you're actually seeing what you're seeing, because rare species are rare. And if you've seen it, that could be a wonderful thing and you've made an observation of a rare species, or you might be mistaking it for something that's a little bit more common. So that was the doing it all by hand version of my process for identifying butterflies. There's another version of doing this, which is a lot faster and a lot easier, which is to upload your picture to iNaturalist and let iNaturalist tell you what it thinks it is. So iNaturalist has this really great computer-assisted identification feature. I've shown in that little pop-up there that I'm uploading this picture of a butterfly, and it's suggesting to me that it's pretty sure it's a common wood nymph, and it's letting me know also that this species has been seen nearby, which is good to know. So I'm not identifying a butterfly that's actually from Asia. This is a butterfly that's been found in our area. So you can upload it and you can trust that identification feature, but you also might want to just check again that species description to ensure that it is a match for what you've seen, same as we talked about with the hard copy guides. If you're not sure, you could stick with the genus or the family. So you see that iNaturalist is suggesting the genus there for the wood nymphs butterfly. And you could say, well, okay, it's probably that genus. I'm not going to say what species because I might not be right. And so you could just stick with a genus or a family and then go back later once you had time to do some reading and confirm what species you think it is. Now, I will note that if you add a butterfly observation to iNaturalist, others will identify it for you, whether or not you want them to. And I mentioned in my first training webinar that there's a really well-established community of people who love finding and identifying butterflies, and a lot of them are on iNaturalist. And we have a couple of people in Ontario that look at literally every butterfly observation that gets posted to iNaturalist, and they will confirm its identification. Sometimes they do it within minutes, sometimes it's within days. But just note that you will get identifications on your butterflies when you put them on iNaturalist. And if you are the kind of person that enjoys the challenge of figuring it out yourself, you might want to try to make that identification before putting it on iNaturalist and having others do it for you. Speaking of iNaturalist, we would love to know your iNaturalist username. So if you have registered for Butterfly Blitz, which I hope you have, there was a question on the registration form about your iNaturalist name, which I hope you filled out. But if you have not yet registered for Butterfly Blitz, or if you didn't fill out your username, I will share my email at the end of this presentation, and we would love it if you would get in touch and just let us know your username, because some people have usernames that are not at all related to their names, and we want to be able to put the username to the real person's name so that we can get in touch and contact you about observations of the week and other things. Okay, now butterfly identification is not always easy, and there are some tricky butterflies in our area. So There are a few groups that are a little harder than others. There's the spring and the summer azure and the Canadian and eastern tiger swallowtail. Now I've put asterisks next to those species groups because in the identification resources that we will share that are on our website, I've linked to some resources that help you understand the differences between these species pairs and how you might identify one versus the other. But I'll note also that these are kind of in flux right now, and you might just have to be satisfied with putting a genus on observations of those kinds of butterflies and never getting a final species name for them. Same actually goes for the northern and pearl crescent, which I've listed below, because those also seem to be in flux right now. There's a lot of disagreement and among taxonomists about how to identify one versus the other. Many dusky wing species are very difficult to tell apart, and the commas can also be difficult, although not as hard as maybe some of the dusky wings and crescents that I mentioned above. Finally, some skippers can be very hard, especially if you don't get photos from multiple angles. All I can say for these species is do your best. You will learn and you will get better, and know that for some of these groups, not even the experts can tell them apart from a photo. All right, what species might you be seeing? Well, we provide with our registration package and on our website a checklist for the watershed of 99 species that might be found here. Now, not all of those species have been seen here recently, but they've at least been seen nearby. And the list itself tells you if the species are common, uncommon, or rare. Also, they'll tell you if they're found in specific habitat types. So it'll say L for localized, maybe something only occurs in wetlands or another particular habitat type. You can use this checklist when you go out if you want to do a time survey or if you just want to keep track of what species you've seen. So this is available on our website. Okay, I mentioned I'm going to go through some ID tips for the 5 families of butterflies that are found in Ontario. So these are those 5 families. We have skippers, swallowtails, brushfoots, whites and sulphurs, and gossamer wings. First up, the brushfoots. Their family name is the Nymphalidae. So these butterflies are medium to large. The first pair of legs is reduced, and that's where they get the name brushfoots from. So you can see in these pictures that it actually looks like they only have 4 legs, and that's because the first pair of legs is actually a lot smaller and modified. They're a really diverse family, and there's a lot of big, beautiful, recognizable species in this family, including the monarch. There's 51 species of this family in Ontario, about 37 of which can be found in the Credit River watershed. So for each family, I've identified the most common species and given you some tips on how to identify it. So I think probably most of you will be familiar with the monarch butterfly. It's a big, bright orange butterfly with black wing veins and white spots along the margins. And I have an arrow in that photo because I mentioned the viceroy, which is a similar butterfly that's a little smaller, has a line going across the hind wing. It has a cross line going across, but the monarch does not. It only has lines running out from its body towards the edge of the wing. So that's how you identify a monarch. Our next family, the skippers, the Hesperiidae, are mostly small to medium butterflies. They have this thick muscled thorax. They're sort of they have antennae with the clubs hooked out. Their wings are often brown with orange, black, gray, or white markings on them. There are about 28 skipper butterflies species that you could find in the watershed. And they can be really tricky, but because there's so many of them, they're actually really fun to try to figure out. I've actually grown a real appreciation for skippers in the past few years with Butterfly Blitz, even though I didn't ever used to find them that exciting. Now I'm really into skippers, especially because some of them live in really localized, distinct, and unique habitats. The peck skipper, the most common species of skipper that you'll see in our area, actually can be found in many different habitats, and that's why it's so common. And the way to identify it, on the underside, it's a brown butterfly. On the underside, it's got these pale yellow patches. And in the middle cell, it pokes out further. So you see there's this big pale yellow patch, and then that middle bit where the arrow is pointing, it sticks out further towards the wing margin. And the way you can remember this is by saying Pex is a pointer. And so you will probably see some peck skippers this summer. I hope so. gossamer wings are small, bluish gray butterflies for the most part. They look very delicate. These are the coppers, the hair streaks, and the blues. Often their wings, especially their hind wings, have spots on them. Some of the species have tails, little things sticking off that look like tails, or eye spots that are pretending to be eyes to look like a head to fool predators. And their upper side of the wings are often iridescent, sort of shiny blue, silver. The most common gossamer wing in the watershed is the silvery blue, and you'll especially start seeing this in the early summer. The underside is gray, so actually both pictures on this slide are silvery blue butterflies, and so it has these row of black spots with white outlines. And it is the only butterfly in our watershed that has those black circles with white outlines around them. The upper sides, like in that bottom picture, are blue. Those are the males, or brownish with some blue. Those are the females with black borders. And this species does not have a tail. So the only butterfly that might look kind of similar from the upper side does have a tail. So this is the silvery blue. The whites and the sulphurs are a pretty small group of species that you might encounter in our watershed, only about 5 species. These are also small to medium butterflies with small rounded wings. They have no tails, and they're white, yellow, or orange with black marks. So the most common species, one you will definitely see a lot of this summer, is the cabbage white butterfly. Cabbage white is actually an introduced species that can occasionally be a pest of crops like cabbages and broccoli and cauliflower and all those. But because there are so many related plants that live just everywhere in disturbed areas, you can find the cabbage white just about everywhere. So it's a small white butterfly. It's got black on the wingtips and some black spots. Males have 1 spot, females have 2. There are other small white butterflies, but they don't have those black spots or black wingtips. So if you see those spots and wingtips, you know it's a cabbage white and not one of our other native small white butterflies. Finally, the swallowtails are medium to very large butterflies. In fact, the largest butterfly in our watershed is the giant swallowtail. And if you see one of those, you will in fact be shocked almost at how large it is. It's like a bird. The hind wings of swallowtails have a tail, like their name implies. And they're all some combination of black and yellow. I mentioned before the eastern tiger swallowtail and the Canadian tiger swallowtail, and that they're difficult to tell apart. And that is also partly because they hybridize, which means they mate and they produce hybrids that are a little bit of eastern tiger swallowtail and a little bit of Canadian tiger swallowtail. So often it's best just to call them tiger swallowtail and leave it at that. There's only 4 species of these that you can see in the watershed. Probably the most common of those is the black swallowtail. So this is a mostly black butterfly. It's got 2 rows of yellow spots along the edges of the wings. The yellow spots are a little bit smaller in the female, so that the picture in the bottom right of the slide is a female. And there's also orange spots near the tail, so near those bits sticking out the hind wings, near the blue markings. Females have more blue than the males do. Okay, now that we've walked through how to identify butterflies, some resources, those 5 families and common species, let's do a bit of a recap. So most important identification characteristics for butterflies are on their wings. And you should always try to look at both the upper and lower sides of the wings if you can, and to get photos of them if you can. It's important to look at all of the small details when looking at butterflies to see if they match up. So read that field guide. Don't just use one feature. So if you say, oh, it's black with yellow spots, it's got to be that species, just read through all the characteristics to make sure it all matches and you're not missing a species that looks pretty similar but has some important differences. On that note, knowing which species look similar and the key differences to separate them is also helpful. And field guides are generally pretty good at pointing those out to you, especially the Butterflies of Ontario field guide. Flipping through a pocket guide or a field guide or using the auto identification feature on iNaturalist can help you get close to a species, but you'll usually need to follow up using a hard copy field guide or a website. Remember that some butterflies are very difficult or even impossible to tell apart from only a photo. So other clues like the habitat, the date, and the host plant can be really helpful. And if you note those things, you can always add those notes to your iNaturalist observation. We've provided a checklist of the 99 species of butterfly that you might see in the watershed that you can use as you help on the journey in the Butterfly Blitz this summer. And don't forget, the more you practice, the better you will get. So go out there as often as you can to try to find and identify butterflies. One last little bit of information I wanted to share with you was about using a butterfly net. So capturing a butterfly in a net and then putting it into a jar is sometimes necessary to be able to identify it, because butterflies don't always cooperate and they don't sit still to let you look at all those tiny little details that you need to look at to check your field guide and make sure you've got the right species. So you can swoop in with your net, get them in the net, and then pop them into a jar so you can take that closer look. Now, we've provided in the resources on our website links to some good video tutorials, a supplier we recommend for nets, and some other information on using a net in our training notes. So I encourage you to read that, but I also just want to emphasize some key points here, which is that you should be very gentle with butterfly wings. They're delicate creatures. Their wings are covered with scales, and if you handle them too roughly with your hands, you will rub off those scales and make it difficult for them to fly. If you do net a butterfly, please release it close to where you found it. Don't put it in a jar and then walk a kilometer away and let it out there. Release it close to where you found it because that's the habitat that they prefer to be in. And if you do put a butterfly in a jar, don't leave it sitting in the sun. Please try to do what you need to do with that butterfly as quickly as you can so it doesn't get too hot inside the jar, which would be bad for it. So, since this is a recorded webinar and I can't take your questions live, I've added in some frequently asked questions that we've received when we've given these training webinars in the past. So the first one is, how can we tell moths and butterflies apart? So many people believe that moths only fly at night and butterflies fly during the day, and that moths are all drab colors and butterflies are all bright colors, but that is not necessarily true. The best way to tell moths and butterflies apart is often in their antennae. Butterfly antennae are usually clubbed, which means they're long and thin with a little club at the end, and moth antennae would be tapered at the end or feathered for some male moths. It is generally true that moths more often fly at night than they do during the day, but there are many day-flying moths and many of them are very brightly colored. So this related question, what if I accidentally observe a moth, which I think is why people get concerned about telling moths and butterflies apart. If you accidentally observe a moth, it is totally fine. In fact, I would love it if you accidentally observe moths because I love people observing all kinds of insects, not just butterflies. But the important thing is that our Butterfly Blitz project on iNaturalist is set up to only include observations of butterflies. So if you add an observation of moths, it just won't be included in the project, and that is okay. But it will be included in maybe a moth project, and you'll be adding important information to that. So by all means, go out there and accidentally observe moths. Are some groups harder to identify than others? The short answer to that is yes, and I think I shared some of that when I was talking about tricky identifications. Skippers are generally harder to identify than others, but then there are those particular species groups or species pairs that can be quite hard to tell apart. As I said, just do your best, keep learning, get feedback from people who've got more experience, and you'll be better at the end of the year than you are at the start, that's for sure. How accurate is the auto ID feature on iNaturalist? Well, it's actually surprisingly accurate. And I'm amazed sometimes at how it can pick up even not very good photos and give a pretty good identification. Now, having said that, if you're unsure, you do have that option to keep it at the genus level or at the family level and then go in afterwards once you've confirmed with some other sources about what species it is. And sometimes iNaturalist does weird things, like it starts suggesting species to you that in no way live around here. And that might be because there's something weird going on with the geolocation on your phone or some settings you have in iNaturalist. So this related question, I have questions about iNaturalist, which isn't really a question, it's a statement. I would encourage you to watch the training webinar on using iNaturalist, which my colleague Lindsay Jennings has recorded and made available on our website. And hopefully you can find all the answers to your questions there. And if you can't, feel free to email us and ask us, and we will follow up with you. How can we get the references you referred to? So I talked about a bunch of different resources that we've got on our website. So species lists, suggested identification resources, tips for tricky groups, using a butterfly net. We also have maps and other resources online. So if you go to our website, cbc.ca/butterflyblitz, you'll see on the right-hand side there, where I've outlined in a pink box, it says downloads and resources. If you go to that site, you will find this whole big list of resources that you can download and use. Finally, if you've got questions that I didn't answer today, or even that don't occur to you right now but come up later as you're out there making observations with the Butterfly Blitz, please don't hesitate to get in touch. We'd love to hear from you and hear about how your summer is going. So thank you very much for your attention today. Take care.